It started with a ramp and ended with a gavel. Karen Whitmore stood at the edge of my porch, clipboard tucked beneath her arm like it was a weapon. Her eyes traced the slope of the wooden ramp leading to my front door, as if it were an eyesore she'd been personally insulted by. Remove it by week's end, or face fines of $1,000 a day. Non-negotiable. I didn't flinch. I leaned against the railing, arms crossed, watching her tighten her grip on that clipboard like it gave her authority over my family. She had no idea who she was talking to, and no idea what I'd built my life defending. "This isn't just a ramp," I said, voice low. "This is protected under federal law, and I'm the one who knows that law better than anyone in this neighborhood." Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. That was all I needed. A single crack in her confidence was enough to remind me why I never feared bullies hiding behind titles. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to someone who thinks they're untouchable, hit subscribe now, because this fight isn't about wood and nails. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in tearing down corruption. I straightened. Michael Rourke, I told her evenly. Civil rights attorney, specializing in disability law. The way her eyebrows twitched told me she hadn't expected that. Most people in Briarwood Lakes assumed I was just another quiet father, keeping to myself. They didn't know I'd built my career on dismantling abuses of power exactly like this. The ramp behind me wasn't just wood bolted together. I'd built it with my own hands, each plank measured with care, each bolt tightened, while Ethan sat nearby in his chair, watching me work with a grin that never faded. My son with cerebral palsy, had waited months for the freedom of getting in and out of the house without being lifted like baggage. That ramp was his independence. And the swing tied, beside it, the old oak beams supporting it, it was the one place he laughed without restraint. That swing had been his sanctuary after long hospital visits, his quiet reprieve when the world seemed too cruel. I'd pushed him on it through summer evenings, the sound of his laughter carrying across the neighborhood like a promise. Karen didn't see that. She didn't see the boy who had fought harder than any adult she'd ever known. She only saw nonconformity. She only saw what she thought lowered her pristine property values. But I saw my son's dignity in every inch of that wood and steel. She thought she could bury us under fines. She thought she could intimidate me into erasing Ethan's independence. What she didn't know, and what she was about to learn, was that this ramp wasn't just Ethan's freedom. It was the line I'd sworn never to let anyone cross. Karen's heels clicked against the pavement as she turned on her heel, muttering something about, "The board will handle this." I didn't move. I watched her walk away, the sun dipping behind the pines that bordered Briarwood Lakes. The ramp creaked slightly behind me, Ethan's swing swaying in the breeze like it had overheard everything. That wasn't just a goodbye from Karen, it was a warning. She was taking this further. By the following afternoon, her threat had arrived in writing. A formal violation notice slid into my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's letterhead in self-important navy ink. The words were carefully chosen. Architectural deviation, community standards, hazard to uniformity. They weren't just targeting the ramp. The letter demanded removal of Ethan's therapy pool and even mentioned unauthorized equipment, as if a wheelchair were contraband. I carried the notice into my kitchen, laying it flat on the mahogany table that had belonged to my father. Its surface was scarred with years of meals, arguments, and strategies. It was where he'd taught me that the law, like a blade, could be sharp enough to protect or destroy depending on who held it. I ran my fingers across the edge of the letter. Karen had overplayed her hand. Instead of citing specifics, she'd lumped in everything she personally disliked. That was her mistake. HOA authority didn't extend into federal protections, and the way she worded this letter exposed her ignorance. She was trying to enforce aesthetics over accessibility, but what rattled me wasn't the fines. It was the deliberate cruelty in her phrasing. Hazard to uniformity. That was her verdict on my son. To her, Ethan wasn't a boy, he was an eyesore. I folded the letter and slipped it into a binder I'd begun keeping on HOA overreach. Every page was numbered, indexed, and cross-referenced. Years of my profession had taught me one truth. Paper trails cut deeper than swords. Later that week, I attended the community meeting at the Briarwood Lakes Clubhouse. It was a sterile building tucked beside the artificial lake, its walls decorated with photographs of manicured lawns and smiling families. Karen presided at the front, flanked by board members who looked more like followers than leaders. She wasted no time in making me the centerpiece of her agenda. "This is not personal," she announced to the 30 residents seated in folding chairs. "It's about preserving the image and integrity of Briarwood Lakes." She waved a copy of the violation notice like it was scripture. "One resident has chosen to disregard the rules. If we allow this, where does it stop?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded, but others glanced at me with unease. They knew Ethan. They'd seen him on the swing, smiling as the breeze caught his hair. I stood, letting the silence stretch until every head turned my way. "This isn't about integrity," I said evenly. "It's about legality, and I assure you what Karen is pushing isn't legal." Karen's lips tightened, but I pressed on. "Under the Fair Housing Act, modifications necessary for a disabled resident aren't optional. They're protected rights. A ramp isn't a deviation. It's compliance with federal law, and for the record, your board has no standing to override that." That word standing hung heavy. Most in the room didn't understand its full weight, but Karen did. I saw the flicker in her eyes, the brief hesitation. Daniel Prescott, the HOA treasurer, sat 2 rows back. His hands fidgeted with a pen, his gaze darting between Karen and me. He looked uneasy, as if trapped between loyalty and conscience. It was the first time I noticed the crack in his armor. The meeting ended with no resolution. Karen stormed out first, her clipboard clutched like a shield. I lingered, speaking quietly with neighbors who approached me. Some whispered support, others admitted fear of reprisal if they spoke out. Walking home beneath the glow of street lamps, I knew this was only the beginning. Karen had declared war, and she believed her authority was absolute. But I had something stronger: the law, my training, and the will to defend my son at any cost. The ramp stood waiting as I returned, silhouetted in the porch light. Ethan's swing swayed gently, almost like it was daring me to fight harder. I placed my hand on its wooden seat, feeling the grain beneath my palm. Karen thought she could erase my son's place here. She was wrong. The next morning, I found a bright orange paper taped to my front door. The font was bold, the message even bolder. "Final warning before legal action." Karen hadn't wasted a second after the meeting. She wanted escalation, and she wanted it fast. I tore it down, folded it carefully, and slid it into my binder with the others. Every threat she delivered would be preserved. That night, I returned to the clubhouse for what was supposed to be a budget review session. Only a handful of residents attended, mostly retirees, who treated HOA meetings like social gatherings. Karen sat at the head of the long conference table, her smile plastered on too tight, like she was daring me to challenge her again. But it wasn't her that caught my attention. It was Daniel Prescott. He sat hunched over his notes, glasses slipping down his nose, his pen tapping against a ledger. His posture screamed discomfort. Each time Karen spoke, his jaw tightened. When she waved her clipboard and declared that nonconformity damages property values, Daniel looked away, almost ashamed. The meeting dragged on with financial jargon, numbers Karen rattled off too quickly for accuracy. That's when I noticed it. Daniel hesitated before reading from his own treasurer's report. He stumbled over the line about community-approved enforcement costs. His voice cracked, just slightly, as if he couldn't bring himself to say it with conviction. I leaned back, studying him. This was the conflicted witness I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. He wasn't like Karen. He wasn't fueled by control or vanity. He was caught in the undertow of her aggression, pulled deeper every time he failed to resist. When the meeting adjourned, I lingered by the door. Daniel packed his papers slowly, deliberately, as if buying time. Karen brushed past without a glance, her perfume trailing like a warning, but Daniel stopped, fiddling with his keys. "You've got more on your plate than most people here realize," I said quietly. His shoulders stiffened. For a moment I thought he might walk away. Instead, he exhaled, long and heavy, like a man carrying a weight he couldn't put down. "I can't talk about board matters," he muttered, but his tone betrayed him. It wasn't defiance, it was guilt. His eyes flicked to mine, and I caught something unspoken there. Conflict. Fear. Regret. "Fair enough," I said. "But remember this, silence can be as dangerous as action." I let the words hang between us, then left, without another word. Outside, the night air was damp with lake breeze. The clubhouse lights glowed behind me, but my mind stayed fixed on Daniel. He was the first sign that Karen wasn't unbreakable. Her own treasurer was cracking under the pressure. If I could bring him forward, if I could turn his unease into testimony, her entire case would unravel. Back at my house, Ethan was asleep, his chair parked beside the swing on the porch. The ramp caught the moonlight, casting a long shadow across the yard. I stood there for a while, listening to the soft creak of the swing moving in the wind. That sound steadied me. Karen saw a violation. I saw my son's freedom, and I wasn't alone anymore. Not completely. Daniel Prescott didn't know it yet, but his struggle was about to become central to this fight. He could keep hiding behind Karen's clipboard, or he could stand beside me when the law came crashing down. Either way, I'd be ready. The silence of the night lingered with me after leaving Daniel in the clubhouse parking lot. His unease was real, but hesitation alone wouldn't stop Karen. I knew her type too well. Every pause only fueled her hunger to press harder. And by the end of the week, she proved me right. A thick envelope arrived by certified mail, the kind that carried more weight than a simple notice. Inside was a formal petition for injunctive relief, drafted with the help of the HOA's attorney. Karen hadn't just escalated, she'd weaponized the courts. She wasn't bluffing anymore. She was demanding a judge order me to tear down the ramp, fill in Ethan's therapy pool, and remove anything she deemed a non-conforming modification. The words on that paper burned hotter than her orange warning notice ever could. It wasn't just fines now, it was litigation. She'd forced this conflict into a place where my every move would be scrutinized. But unlike Karen, I understood that courtroom terrain. It was where I lived, where I worked, where I'd spent my career. She had walked us straight into my arena. I carried the petition to my office downtown, a modest space tucked between a bail bonds agency and a tax consultant. The smell of old case files clung to the walls, the hum of fluorescent lights steady overhead. This wasn't Briarwood Lakes, it was neutral ground, and it reminded me who I was outside the shadow of Karen's intimidation. I laid the petition flat on my desk and traced the HOA attorney's letterhead. They'd built their case around community uniformity and aesthetic preservation, citing vague bylaws with language so sloppy it was almost laughable. But what caught my attention was a single line at the bottom. Authority pursuant to Articles of Incorporation, 2002. I froze. I'd seen those filings before, years ago, when I'd helped a colleague in a different case. Incorporation documents weren't permanent. They had to be renewed, maintained, updated. If Karen had failed to keep those filings in good standing, the HOA's entire legal authority to enforce anything could crumble. That possibility lit a spark in me. The victory strategy wasn't just about defending Ethan, it was about undermining Karen at the very foundation. If I could prove the board lacked standing, every violation notice she had ever issued would be void. The ramp, the pool, the swing, they wouldn't just be protected, they'd be untouchable. The discovery wasn't dramatic, but it was surgical. It was the kind of flaw most people overlooked, yet it could topple the entire structure of her campaign. I jotted down notes, cross-referencing the case law I knew by heart, circling Articles of Incorporation, 2002, until the page was nearly shredded by my pen. The next step was clear. I needed to confirm whether those documents were current. That meant official records, not speculation. County filings, state corporation databases, the dry, technical places where truth slept, quietly until someone bothered to wake it. I leaned back, staring at the petition. Karen thought she was tightening the noose, dragging me into her courtroom theater. What she didn't realize was that she'd handed me the script, and I'd already spotted the typo that would bring the curtain down. Still, the weight of it pressed on me. I thought of Ethan, asleep at home, his swing swaying in the night breeze. He had no idea how far Karen was willing to go. He only knew the ramp gave him freedom, the pool gave him strength, the swing gave him peace. And here was a woman trying to strip all of that away with a piece of paper. I turned off the office lights, locking the petition in my case file drawer. Tomorrow, I'd begin the records inquiry. Tonight, I carried the certainty with me. Karen had finally stepped onto my battlefield, and I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The law itself was waiting at my side. The county clerk's office smelled of paper and dust, a mixture that clung to the air no matter how many fresh coats of paint they added. I'd spent years in places like this, chasing down records that could turn a case upside down. The walls were lined with metal cabinets, drawers stuffed with filings most residents never thought about until they mattered. For me, today, they mattered more than anything. I signed the request sheet and waited while the clerk disappeared into the archives. My fingers drummed against the counter, steady but deliberate. Karen believed she was tightening her case, marching toward the courtroom with confidence. What she didn't realize was that the heart of her authority could be nothing more than expired paperwork. The clerk returned with a slim folder marked Briarwood Lakes Association, Articles of Incorporation. The tab was worn, the edges frayed. She slid it across the counter, and I carried it to a table beneath the dim yellow glow of a desk lamp. Opening the file, I scanned quickly. Filed 2002, amended once in 2007. Renewals were required every 10 years under state law. I flipped page after page, heart steady but rising with every turn. The last filing was dated 2011. That was it. Nothing after. No renewal, no extension, no updated articles. For over a decade, Briarwood Lakes HOA had been operating on expired incorporation. Legally, their authority wasn't just weak, it was non-existent. Karen's threats, her fines, her violation, notices they were a house of cards, stacked on a foundation that had already crumbled. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the pages in front of me. The discovery wasn't dramatic in appearance, just black ink on aging paper. But the implications thundered louder than any confrontation we'd had so far. Karen wasn't just wrong, she was powerless. Still, I needed confirmation beyond these sheets. Courts required precision, and I wouldn't give Karen the chance to wriggle free on a technicality. I pulled out my phone and logged into the state corporation database. A quick search confirmed it in bold red text. Briarwood Lakes Association, inactive, divided by delinquent. There it was, digital proof to back the paper trail. The HOA no longer had standing to enforce its bylaws. The very case Karen filed was built on authority she didn't legally hold. I copied the database entry, photographed the paper records, and slid everything back into the folder before returning it to the clerk. My binder at home would soon have its sharpest weapon yet. Walking out into the afternoon sun, I felt the air shift. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the first clear break in the storm. Karen thought she was pushing me into a corner. Instead, she had forced me into the one place where I was strongest, and now I carried a weapon she couldn't see coming. On the drive back to Briarwood Lakes, the houses looked different. The manicured lawns, the identical mailboxes, the freshly painted shutters, they were symbols of control. But they were also illusions. Karen's power had always been about appearances, and now I knew it was hollow at its core. When I pulled into my driveway, Ethan was outside with the swing. He waved, his grin bright against the afternoon light. For a moment, the weight of the fight lifted. He didn't know about petitions or incorporation documents. He only knew the ramp gave him freedom, and the swing gave him joy. That was enough to remind me why every detail mattered. I joined him on the porch, listening to the creak of the swing as it rocked back and forth. My binder sat inside on the table, waiting for the new evidence I would add tonight. Karen had escalated, but so had I. The next move would be hers, but for the first time, I held the stronger hand. The law was on my side, and soon, the entire community would see the truth. The binder lay open on the mahogany table, its pages thick with violation notices, photos, and now, the damning records from the county clerk. The words, inactive divided by delinquent, stared back at me from the printed database entry. Proof. Hard proof. For a moment, I let the silence of the house wrap around me, the kind of silence that settles just before a storm hits. Then came the knock. Sharp. Repetitive. Karen's knock. I opened the door to find her standing there, with two board members trailing behind her like bodyguards. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've decided to pursue emergency relief," she said, waving a packet of papers like it was a weapon. "By next week, the court will hear our request to force removal of the ramp." Her confidence was performative, but her eyes flicked toward my binder on the table inside. She didn't know what it contained, but she sensed it mattered. "Your board doesn't have the authority," I replied calmly. "Not anymore." For the first time, she faltered. Only for a second, but it was there, the crack in the armor. She pushed past it with a smirk. "We'll see what the judge says." Then she turned, on her heel, and left, her entourage scurrying after her. I closed the door and sat back down at the table. Her threat wasn't idle. She was dragging me and my son into open court. That meant exposure, public scrutiny, and the weight of a system most families wouldn't survive. But I wasn't most families, and Ethan wasn't a liability. He was my reason. That night, I took Ethan to the park on the edge of town, not Briarwood Lakes. Karen would never allow swings with chipped paint or a basketball court cracked by roots. This park was older, rougher, but alive with kids shouting and parents chatting under the dim glow of street lamps. Ethan laughed as I pushed him on a swing, his voice carrying above the clatter of the playground. As he soared forward, his laughter echoing, I thought about what Karen's words really meant. To her, he was nonconformity, a hazard to uniformity. To me, he was the embodiment of perseverance, of joy forged through struggle. That ramp at our house wasn't just wood and bolts, it was the bridge between confinement and freedom. And now, Karen was trying to take it away in front of a judge. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't about violation notices or fines anymore. It was about Ethan's dignity being weighed against Karen's obsession with control. I tightened my grip on the swing's chain, letting the cold metal bite into my skin. The next day, I drove to the courthouse to file my official response. The building's marble columns loomed tall, the flag snapping overhead in the breeze. Inside, the clerk accepted my filings with a neutral nod, stamping each page with a heavy thud. Each stamp was a promise. Karen had forced this into the open, and now it would be fought on my terms. Outside, I spotted Daniel Prescott leaning against the rail near the steps. His posture was stiff, his expression guarded. "She's pushing too far," he murmured when I approached. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the sound of traffic, but I caught the tremor in it. "You know it," I answered. "And you also know what those filings look like." Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze darting away. He didn't say more, but his silence was telling. He was closer to breaking than before. Karen might have her clipboard and her arrogance, but I had the law, and soon, I suspected, I'd have Daniel too. When I returned home that evening, the porch swing rocked gently in the evening breeze. I sat beside it, running a hand across the grain of the wood. It felt like the heartbeat of the fight itself, steady, unyielding, tied to everything that mattered. Karen wanted uniformity. What she was about to get was a courtroom reckoning. The swing creaked in the evening wind as I sat there, steadying myself for what was coming. Karen had drawn the battle lines in court, but the cracks were forming inside her own board. I'd seen it in Daniel's face outside the courthouse, fear mixed with guilt, the look of a man who knew he was standing on the wrong side of the line. 2 nights later, the phone rang just past 10. The number was blocked, but the voice was unmistakable. "Rourke, it's Daniel." He paused, his breathing uneven. "We can't talk long, but I need you to know you're right. The incorporation, it's expired. Karen knows it too." I didn't interrupt. He was unraveling faster than I expected. "She ordered me to alter the treasurer's reports," he whispered. "She wanted me to write that the renewal was paid and processed, but it never was. I couldn't sign it. That's why I stumble when I read the reports at meetings. I can't lie for her anymore." There it was, the confession I'd suspected, now spoken aloud. Daniel Prescott, the HOA treasurer, was admitting that Karen had tried to fabricate authority the board didn't have. "Meet me tomorrow," I said. "Not at the clubhouse, somewhere neutral." The next afternoon, we sat in the corner booth of a diner off the highway, a place far enough from Briarwood Lakes that no curious eyes would wander in. Daniel looked worn, his shirt wrinkled, his hands trembling as he stirred coffee he never drank. "She's ruthless," he muttered. "I joined the board to keep the books balanced, to make sure neighbors weren't overcharged, but Karen turned it into a weapon. She wants control at any cost, and anyone who questions her gets isolated." He looked up at me then, eyes bloodshot. "Your son's ramp, it's not about the wood, it's about her proving she can erase whatever she doesn't like." I slid the folder across the table. Inside were the photocopies from the clerk's office and the state database printout. "This is bigger than her clipboard. If you're willing to testify, this all collapses." His hand hovered over the folder but didn't open it. "You don't understand. She has allies. She's promised contracts to certain residents, favors to others. If I go against her, they'll come after me too." I leaned in. "Daniel, she's already destroyed her own authority. The law doesn't bend because Karen demands it. You know the truth, and you're the one person who can confirm it in court. Without you, she'll claim these records are misunderstandings. With you, she has no ground left to stand on." He sat back, the conflict written in every twitch of his jaw. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "I'll do it, but I'm not doing it for you." His voice steadied. "I'm doing it because when she called your son a hazard, I wanted to disappear. My wife teaches children with disabilities. If she knew I stayed silent, she'd never forgive me. That was enough. We agreed to keep the arrangement quiet until the hearing. Daniel would prepare his statement, and I would handle the filings. As we stood to leave, he gripped my arm. "Be careful," he warned. "Karen doesn't lose gracefully." Driving back through Briarwood Lakes, I noticed curtains twitch as my truck passed. The community was watching, whispers spreading. Some saw me as the neighbor stirring trouble. Others, I knew, saw me as the man standing against Karen's unchecked power. When I pulled into the driveway, Ethan was waiting on the swing, his laughter breaking through the tension in my chest. He waved, and I waved back, the folder on the passenger seat beside me. I had what I needed now. Karen's fortress wasn't just weakened, it was compromised from within. The ramp glowed in the porch light, solid and unshakable. Karen wanted it gone. What she didn't realize was that every plank had become a line in the case against her. And now, with Daniel at my side, those lines were about to be read in court. The porch light flickered as I carried the folder inside, Ethan's laughter still echoing faintly behind me. I set the binder on the table and flipped it open. The weight of the fight spread across the pages. Violation notices, photographs of the ramp, certified letters, incorporation filings, all the pieces were there. Now, with Daniel's confession, the outlines of a plan sharpened. It was time to build the counterstrike. The next morning I drove downtown to the legal library attached to the county courthouse. Rows of shelves stretched into silence, filled with case law, statutes, and thick binders of precedent. The smell of ink and old paper was oddly comforting. It was the same smell I had lived with in law school, the smell of battles fought on paper before they ever reached the courtroom. I took a seat near the back and spread out my notes. The victory strategy was clear. Expose the HOA's expired incorporation and prove they had no legal standing to enforce any of their bylaws. But Karen wouldn't give up easily. She would claim technical errors, misfiled renewals, anything to muddy the waters. I needed precedent to shut her arguments down before they even left her attorney's mouth. Hours slipped by as I cross-referenced statutes. Florida corporate law required nonprofits like HOAs to renew their incorporation every 10 years. Case law confirmed that expired filings voided enforcement power until reinstated. Even if Karen tried to refile now, it wouldn't retroactively validate the years of expired authority. I highlighted passages, copied citations, and drafted the skeleton of my argument. This wasn't about burying her in paperwork. It was about precision. One strike, delivered cleanly, that would leave no room for recovery. Midway through the research, I received a message from Daniel. A single line. "I've written my statement. I'll deliver it when the time comes." That small confirmation steadied me. He was terrified, yes, but he was committed. Karen's power had already cost him his peace of mind. Now it would cost her the case. By evening, I returned home with a stack of copies and a fresh binder dedicated solely to the standing issue. I laid it on the table beside Ethan, who was sketching with crayons. He glanced at the binder, then at me. "That's for court, right?" he asked softly. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "This one's important." His eyes flicked toward the ramp, visible through the window. "They can't take it, can they?" I rested a hand on his shoulder. They can't, not anymore." The next day, I met with a fellow attorney, an old colleague, who specialized in nonprofit law. We sat in a quiet cafe near the courthouse, papers spread across the table. He skimmed the filings, then looked up with raised brows. "Michael, this isn't just a hole in their case. This is a crater. If you bring this up in court, the judge won't just deny their petition. He might question their entire operation." That was exactly what I needed to hear. My plan wasn't reckless, it was grounded, precise, and legally airtight. Karen had opened the door to litigation, and I was walking in armed with the very law she pretended to wield. Driving back through Briarwood Lakes, I noticed neighbors trimming hedges, walking dogs, chatting in driveways. Life in the community seemed ordinary, but I could feel the undercurrent shifting. Rumors had begun to circulate. People whispered about the lawsuit, about Karen's obsession with the ramp, about me standing toe-to-toe with her. Whether they admitted it or not, they were waiting to see what would happen in that courtroom. At home, the swing moved in the twilight breeze. I sat on the porch, binder in my lap, and felt the weight of the plan solidify. I wasn't just defending a ramp or a pool. I was dismantling the foundation Karen had built her empire on. The strategy was set, the evidence was ready, the witness was prepared. All that remained was execution. The swing creaked softly as I sat with the binder on my lap, the evening air heavy with the scent of cut grass. The plan was clear now, but clarity alone wouldn't win. Execution mattered, and execution meant preparation. Karen would come into the courtroom armed with her attorney, her clipboard, and her rehearsed fury. I needed to be ready for every angle, every lie, every desperate attempt to mask the weakness at the core of her case. The next morning, I drove to the law office where I kept my trial materials. It wasn't glamorous, just a small suite above a hardware store, but it was where I'd built cases that outlasted bigger firms with more money. I spread everything across the conference table: violation notices, incorporation records, statutes, Daniel's pending statement. Piece by piece, I built the scaffolding of the counterattack. The first step was organization. Judges didn't wade through piles of paper, they listened for precision. I created 3 folders. The first contained evidence of the expired incorporation, certified records from the clerk's office, digital printouts from the state database, and highlighted statutory requirements. The second folder held the expired HOA's overreach, their violation notices, photographs of the ramp and pool, and the language Karen had used to target Ethan as a hazard to uniformity. The third folder was Daniel's domain, his treasurer's reports, his confession, and the draft statement he promised to deliver. Each folder was tabbed, indexed, and rehearsed in my head like a script. I imagined Karen's attorney arguing technical oversight, and pictured myself countering with statute numbers and case law, each response cutting through the noise. In the afternoon, I met Daniel again, this time at his office downtown. He closed the blinds before speaking, his nerves still raw. "I've typed it all," he said, sliding a folded document across the desk. "Everything she asked me to alter, every time she pressured me to fabricate renewals." I unfolded the pages and read quietly. His words were straightforward, unembellished, but damning. He described Karen instructing him to present false reports, to claim renewal fees had been paid when they hadn't, to reassure homeowners that the board's authority was intact. He ended with one line that carried the weight of every conflict he'd felt: "I cannot continue enabling deception at the expense of my neighbors." "This will matter," I told him. "You're not just helping me, you're protecting everyone here." Daniel rubbed his temples. "You don't understand. People think Karen is the HOA. They don't realize how fragile it all island. When this comes out, there will be fallout." I nodded. "Yes, and maybe that's the point. The community deserves the truth." Leaving his office, I felt the final piece click into place. The expired incorporation wasn't just a weakness, it was a fault line. With Daniel's testimony, the ground under Karen's authority would give way completely. That evening, I held a quiet practice session in the community center. It was empty except for me, a stack of papers, and the echo of my own voice. I rehearsed opening statements, responses, and closing arguments. I pictured the judge's questions, Karen's interruptions, the whispers from neighbors who would attend out of curiosity or fear. Each time I spoke the words aloud, they grew sharper. "Your Honor, this board lacks standing. Their incorporation lapsed in 2011. Every action since has been taken without authority." The sentence rolled off my tongue with finality. It wasn't bluster, it was fact. By the time I returned home, darkness had settled over Briarwood Lakes. Porch lights glowed, sprinklers hissed, and the neighborhood wore its mask of order. But beneath it, the truth waited. Soon, the mask would crack. Ethan was asleep by the window, his chair angled toward the ramp. I paused, watching him breathe, the swing moving faintly outside in the breeze. That ramp was more than an object, it was the battlefield itself. Karen had chosen it as her target, but she had miscalculated. By aiming at my son, she had given me the resolve to dismantle everything she stood on. The preparation was finished. The stage was set. The courtroom would be the arena, and there, Karen would finally meet the weight of her own undoing. The swing outside my window creaked in the night wind as I reviewed the folders one last time. Preparation was over. Now came positioning. Court was days away. But Karen wasn't waiting. Word spread quickly in Briarwood. Lake's neighbors whispered about the lawsuit against the ramp, Karen boasting that the board was about to make an example out of me. The stage wasn't just the courtroom anymore. It was the entire neighborhood. The next morning, I drove to the local community hall, where the judge had ordered a preliminary mediation session. It was supposed to be neutral ground, an attempt to settle before the formal hearing. Karen arrived with her attorney, a tall man in a tailored suit who carried himself like he'd already won. She wore her clipboard across her chest, like armor, lips pressed into a permanent smirk. The mediator, a gray-haired man with patient eyes, welcomed us into a conference room. Long table, notepads, pitchers of water. On the surface, calm. Underneath, tension sharp enough to cut. Karen wasted no time. She slid copies of violation notices across the table, her attorney adding polished rhetoric about aesthetic damage and declining property values. I listened without interrupting, let them lay out the performance. When they finished, I slid my first folder forward. Certified documents, stamped and dated, Briarwood Lakes Association, incorporation expired 2011. Your board lacks standing, I said, my tone measured but firm. You've been operating without legal authority for more than a decade. Karen's smirk wavered. The attorney adjusted his tie, scanning the pages. This is a technical oversight, he countered. The board can renew at any time. I leaned forward, tapping the highlighted statute. Renewal doesn't reach backward. You can't resurrect authority that's been dead for 12 years. Every fine, every notice, every threat invalid. The mediator cleared his throat, sensing the weight of the moment. Karen flushed, her grip on the clipboard tightening. You think one piece of paper erases community standards? She snapped. This isn't about paper, I answered. It's about law, and the law protects my son's rights far more than your expired rules ever could. Silence hung heavy. Even the mediator seemed to recognize settlement was impossible. Karen stormed out first, her heels striking the tile like gunshots. Her attorney followed, face pale. I gathered my folders calmly, each page a weapon she couldn't counter. Outside, I paused on the steps of the hall. Neighbors had gathered nearby, some curious, some anxious. They wanted to know what had happened inside. I didn't speak, but Daniel was there, standing among them. His nod was subtle, but it carried weight. He was ready. That evening, I walked with Ethan down to the lake. The sun dipped low, the water catching fire in its reflection. Ethan's hand rested on the ramp's railing as he moved onto the porch swing. He didn't ask about Court or Karen. He just smiled as the swing carried him back and forth, the world simpler in his eyes. But for me, the simplicity was gone. Every move mattered now. I organized Daniel's statement, polishing it into affidavit form. I rehearsed with him over the phone, his voice steadying each time he read aloud. He was still afraid, but the fear was turning into resolve. Karen had underestimated him, just as she'd underestimated me. Later that night, I drafted my opening statement. The words had to cut through noise, through Karen's theatrics, through the fog of HOA arrogance. Your Honor, this case isn't about aesthetics, it's about authority, and this board has none. I repeated it until it rang like steel in my chest. By midnight, the binders were closed, packed, ready for court. I stepped outside once more, standing beside the swing as it rocked empty in the breeze. Karen thought she was walking into a battle of wills. What she didn't see yet was that her own board treasurer was about to pull the ground out from under her. The preparations were complete. The battlefield was set. The next time we faced each other, it would be under oath, and the truth would echo louder than any gavel. The courthouse buzzed with low voices as neighbors from Briarwood Lakes filled the gallery. They hadn't come for routine business, they'd come for spectacle. Karen had promised them a victory, told them the ramp would be torn down and the community restored to order. I could see them now, whispering in the wooden benches, eyes darting between me at the defense table and Karen seated proudly beside her attorney. The judge entered, robes flowing, and the room stilled. He took his seat, gavel striking once. Briarwood Lakes Association versus Rourke, he announced. We'll hear arguments. Karen's attorney stood first, voice smooth, polished. He spoke of community values, architectural standards, and property rights. He painted the ramp as a violation, the pool as an intrusion, the swing as a disruption of uniformity. He gestured toward Karen, who sat with her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield, nodding as though each word was gospel. When he finished, the judge turned to me. I rose slowly, sliding the first binder onto the podium. My voice carried steady across the courtroom. Your Honor, this case is not about aesthetics, it is about authority, and this board has none. I handed forward the certified documents from the county clerk and the state database entries. The Briarwood Lakes Association allowed its incorporation to lapse in 2011. By law, it has had no standing to enforce bylaws or collect fines since that time. Every action it has taken against my family and others is void. The judge's brow furrowed as he scanned the documents. Karen's attorney shifted, his earlier polish cracking. "This is a clerical oversight," he protested. "The board intended to renew." "Intent," I replied, "doesn't rewrite statutes. You cannot retroactively create authority." Karen stiffened, her knuckles white against her clipboard. For the first time, the gallery murmured not in support, but in confusion. Neighbors exchanged glances, realizing the board they had feared might have been powerless all along. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I called Daniel Prescott to the stand. He walked forward slowly, avoiding Karen's glare as he raised his right hand and swore the oath. Taking his seat, he adjusted his glasses, hands trembling only slightly. I began gently. "Mr. Prescott, you are the treasurer of Briarwood Lakes Association, correct?" "Yes," he said quietly. "Did the board renew its articles of incorporation after 2011? He hesitated, the silence stretching. Then, with a glance at the judge, he said, "We did not." The room erupted in whispers. Karen's face flushed red, her eyes boring into him with fury. But Daniel wasn't finished. "Did Karen Whitmore ever instruct you to falsify reports regarding renewal?" I asked. He swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes. She asked me to present reports claiming renewal fees had been paid when they hadn't. I refused to sign them as true, but I read them under pressure. I regret that." Gasps filled the room. Karen shot to her feet. "Lies." "He's lying!" she shouted. The judge slammed the gavel, demanding order. Daniel's voice shook, but he pressed on. "Your Honor, I can no longer support deception. The board has acted without authority, and Mrs. Whitmore has led us into this mess. That's the truth." The gallery wasn't whispering now, it was roaring. Neighbors leaned forward, wide-eyed, as the facade they'd lived under began to collapse. The judge silenced the room again, but the damage was done. Karen sat seething, her clipboard forgotten on the table. I delivered my closing statement with calm precision. "Your Honor, this association has wielded expired authority to intimidate families and strip them of rights guaranteed under federal law. My son's ramp isn't a violation, it's a necessity, protected by the Fair Housing Act, and this board lacks the legal standing to say otherwise." The judge nodded, taking notes, his expression unreadable. He announced that a ruling would be delivered the next morning. The gavel struck once more, ending the session. As we filed out, I caught Ethan's smile from the gallery. He didn't understand every word, but he knew what mattered. His ramp had been defended, his dignity upheld. Karen had wanted a public confrontation, and she had gotten one. Only it wasn't me left exposed, it was her. The courthouse lobby was still buzzing the next morning when I arrived. Neighbors clustered in small groups, voices low but charged, the echoes bouncing off marble walls. They weren't talking about me anymore, they were talking about Karen, about Daniel's testimony, about the revelation that the board they feared had been operating without legal authority for over a decade. Inside the courtroom, the judge entered promptly, his robe flowing as he took the bench. The gallery hushed, anticipation thick enough to touch. Karen sat rigid, her clipboard clutched against her chest as if it could shield her from what was about to happen. Her attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, but the color had drained from his face. The judge cleared his throat and began. "After review of the filings, testimony, and applicable law, this court finds that the Briarwood Lakes Association lacks current corporate standing. Its incorporation lapsed in 2011 and has not been properly renewed." His gaze swept the room, steady and unflinching. "Accordingly, the association has no legal authority to enforce the violations brought against Mr. Rourke or any other homeowner." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The gavel struck once, but the words still hung in the air like a thunderclap. Karen's jaw clenched, her knuckles white as she gripped her clipboard tighter. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "the court finds credible the testimony of Mr. Prescott regarding efforts to conceal this lapse. Any future actions by this board will remain invalid until proper legal standing is reestablished." He set his papers aside, eyes narrowing slightly. "And Mrs. Whitmore, you may expect further inquiry into your conduct." Karen's face drained of color. The courtroom buzzed louder now, neighbors exchanging shocked looks, some whispering angrily. For years, they had paid fines, submitted to her control, bent under her authority. Now they realized it had all been smoke. I stood, the binder closed in my hands. "Thank you, Your Honor." My voice carried, not just for the court, but for every neighbor who needed to hear it. As the judge adjourned, the gavel's final strike seemed to echo beyond the walls. Outside, the air felt lighter. Neighbors approached cautiously at first, then more boldly thanking me, asking questions, some even apologizing for staying silent under Karen's reign. Daniel emerged quietly, his shoulders no longer hunched. He didn't smile, but the relief in his eyes said enough. He had carried the weight of her deception for too long, and now he was free of it. Karen stormed past, her heels striking the floor in sharp bursts. The clipboard was still in her arms, but it looked smaller now, flimsy. Neighbors didn't step aside for her the way they once did. They watched her go with narrowed eyes, some even shaking their heads. The tide had turned, and she felt it. When I arrived home, Ethan was on the swing. He looked up, expectant, and I nodded. "It's safe," I told him. "The ramp, the pool, everything. They can't touch it." He grinned, pushing off with his feet to set the swing in motion. His laughter filled the air, light and unrestrained, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe fully. That sound was why I had fought, why I had endured every notice, every meeting, every glare from Karen. Neighbors began walking by that evening. Some stopped to talk, others simply offered nods of respect. The symbolic ramp, once marked as a violation, now stood as proof that authority could be challenged and defeated when it was rooted in deception. I sat on the porch beside Ethan, my hand resting on the swing's worn wooden seat. The fight had started as a battle over wood and steel, but it ended as something greater. It was about dignity, about law, about reminding a community that fear has no place where truth stands. Karen's clipboard couldn't erase that. For those watching this unfold, remember this: power isn't always real just because someone claims it. And sometimes, all it takes to expose a bully is one person willing to stand, one witness willing to speak, and one gavel striking down the lie.